counsellor said, set a goal. And I thought, obviously, you don't have, experienced grief.
Yeah.
So and I thought, I have goals. I'm doing postgraduate study. I've got this really busy job. I'm doing this, this, and this. That is absolutely no help.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Mate, and you have tuned in to the In-Betweeners Checkup. I'm here today with Kay Thomas, who has very kindly offered to share, I guess, part of her story in her life with us today. Kay, I first met, maybe 6 or 7 years back now, when she was teaching with my wife. She has since moved on to that and is now dabbling in politics, which I think she's enjoying a lot, but I'm going to pass it over to her and she can tell us a little bit more about herself.
I have had a career of over 30 years in teaching and management in secondary schools, which I've really enjoyed, and think I've been lucky to have to work in an area that I've really enjoyed, and not many people end up having a whole career in an area they love, and I've been quite fortunate like that.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I think for myself, I've kind of been reflecting on my work situation over the last little bit, and there's been a bit of a change for me, and now I'm in a space that just everything feels like it's flowing, and it's really good. But look, it's taken me a while to get there. I'm there now, which is great, but I guess kudos to you for finding that earlier on in the piece. In terms of, I guess, those things that haven't worked out so well for you thus far, are you happy to kind of give us a little bit more around what's happened for you?
In 2004, I was in a study group, and we were preparing for a postgraduate qualification. It was during the school holidays, so that's why the study group was meeting, and we just finished, and I got a phone call from my son's place of work to say he hadn't been at work for 4 days, and he had in previous years made several attempts to commit suicide, and so I immediately panicked, went round, tried to get into his flat, couldn't get in, tried to walk around, tried to find him, and in the end gave up and went late to the lecture I was meant to be attending that evening. During the lecture, I got a phone call from my daughter to say that my son's flatmate had returned from holiday, and he had rung my daughter to say that he had come home and found my son dead, that he had committed suicide. And so because of his previous history and of trying to commit suicide, it wasn't a total shock, because we knew he had periods of depression, and we had helped him seek counselling, but he had not persevered with that, because I think possibly when questions got hard, and there's a time in counselling when you have to start doing some work, I think that's probably when he decided it wasn't for him. He also had, he had problems with alcohol. He drank far too much. In fact, I think was, if not an alcoholic, a borderline alcoholic. And the combination of depression and alcohol it's a fairly deadly combination, really. So over the previous 3 or 4 years, we tried to spend quite a bit of time getting him to talk. He would talk when he'd had too much to drink, but when he sobered up, he would just deny he'd said anything. So it was hard to make headway to talk about the things that were bothering him. And so on that day in 2004, he was successful. We found out that we don't have an exact date for his death, because the coroner could only, from the autopsy, he may have died 3 or 4 days before his body was found. I was just relieved that I was still able to see his body and spend time with him, that he was still, you know, that after he had been through the autopsy and spent time with the funeral people, that we could still spend time with him with an open casket.
So I guess there was an opportunity as such for you to take some kind of closure from the situation.
Yes, because in the casket he looked quite peaceful, and it made me realise he hadn't really looked at peace for quite a long time. I think he was in hospitality. I think the nature of his job meant they finished work late and there was nobody around to socialise with, and it's actually quite a lonely lifestyle. Yeah. So, yeah. So the days after that, I was still in shock, and you get kind of busy with organising a funeral and seeing to all of those things that have to be done. And so I think, although I was, it's hard to describe it because it was kind of empty, you know, felt just quite empty and shocked. The first few days doing all those things actually kept me busy, so I didn't have time to think about it. It was after the funeral that it all started to really sink in. It kind of, the scariest thing was one night I was lying in bed and I thought, I'm dying, I'm having a heart attack. My heart was beating so fast, and I thought, I'm going to have a heart attack and die, and there's all these people in the house that had come to stay after the funeral, and nobody will know because I'm lying here. And I kept saying, breathe, 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 and it was my first and only experience so far of a panic attack, and it was very, very frightening. Other than that, it was kind of like being in grey sludge. It went on like that for about 3 weeks. And then one day, and I was at school, and it just suddenly overwhelmed me, and I started crying and I couldn't stop, and it was loud and noisy, and I wandered through the school. Fortunately, nobody was around, they were all in cars, and went to a counsellor and sat down with her, and that kind of broke this massive floodwater of grief, because although before that I was grieving, it was kind of like walking through sludge, and it was that after 3 weeks when suddenly I think the shock wore off and it just was totally overwhelming. Really difficult situation to deal with because of the people around me. I was in a very multicultural school. The Pacifica and Indian teachers and kids were wonderful. They were able to say, look, I'm sorry for your loss. They were able to speak to me. The Pākehā people, adults and kids, were embarrassed. Some of them would cross the, go out of their way so they didn't have to meet up with me and talk to me. And I think it was, they didn't know what to say and they were embarrassed. But I was very, very aware that that was happening. And for quite a while, so I still have quite a lot of fondness for some of those Indian Pacifica people who were able to be empathetic with me rather than feel a kind of, oh, what am I going to say? How am I going to react? That really sticks in my mind, I have to say.
I mean, I think New Zealand, I mean, we have one of the highest rates of youth suicide in the world. And I believe, and rightly or wrongly, that a large part of that is because of the fact that we don't talk about this stuff enough. I know there's a tendency in the media to keep quiet, to not necessarily, I can't think what the word is, draw the wrong type of attention to the situation. But at the same time, we need to be talking about it, and we need to be, if we can, I guess, working with people during those earlier periods to try and bring them to a different resolution. I mean, we had a flatmate who committed suicide, thankfully not in the house while we were there, but it was still a shock. We found out afterwards she'd actually tried a couple of times previously, and I guess on one note there was kind of, oh, you know, if we'd picked up the signs, maybe we could have done something. But I guess that was what it was, and we kind of had to just let that go and move on. But I guess because of that situation, I'm now that much more conscious of when someone is in a difficult place and they might not be asking for help. How can I offer an olive branch is right, but just put myself in a position where they might be comfortable in sharing whatever burden is that they have with them.
Well, I learned quickly that it was really important to talk about. Within weeks, I asked the principal if I could speak at assembly, and bless him, he didn't. I mean, I was not in a really good state, so bless him that he agreed to that. And I thought I will just coldly and calmly say, this is what's happened. You know, please go and talk to a counsellor if you feel, you know. What happened though was, just before I went onto the stage to speak, the musical item that was played was Hallelujah, was one that we played while my son was being cremated. So it actually meant when I went to speak, I had tears streaming down my face. And what I really talked about, and said, some of you know my son died over the holidays, and I basically talked about the importance of asking for help, especially for boys to ask for help. And some of the teachers told me that lots of the kids were also had tears in their eyes, and some of the staff. The outcome of that was that the counselling staff said I had made it acceptable to talk about death. And they had so many students go to them and talk about death and grieving they were trying to cope with, because suddenly it made it acceptable to talk about that.
And I mean, that's the beautiful thing, is it only takes one person being vulnerable to create an environment where others can be, I guess, can potentially feel vulnerable as well. But too often we don't express these emotions, and we don't say what's really going on. And I guess it's one thing to say that to your partner or your family member. It's another thing to, I guess, get up in front of a large group of people and do that. So well done to you.
Well, the good thing was I was crying. I think if I'd gone up as I initially tried to, it wouldn't have touched in the same way. But it was actually the music that created that. It was kind of almost like kismet that, you know, that happened.
But I guess it meant that the message that you presented was real. And people could connect with it. And there was a genuineness and a rawness. And you, I mean, you talked about the emotion that other people express. So they either they could feel what you were feeling, or it resonated with their own experiences. So that's really amazing. And I guess from that situation, did you then take that as a platform's the right word to then talk to other groups around it? Or
what started to happen, not straight away, because I was still really in a bit of a mess, but in the following years, when there were students with who would think, you know, they called suicide ideation, often the counsellors would bring them to me, and I would talk to them about what it does to families. And I'd talk about the fact that my daughter, who taught in the same school, so most of them knew her or knew of her, that she was still angry because her brother had abandoned her. And so I talk about the impact that his grandparents had stood at his casket and said, it shouldn't have been you, it should have been me. You don't go before us, and talked about that whole concept about you know, the time in a season. So for the kids, because often when kids are thinking about it, they don't think about the impact. And so I would always say to the kids, I'm not a counsellor, I'm really an English teacher, but I'm going to tell you what it's like for families when that happens. And I'd sometimes say, you think, you know, sometimes I'd say to kids who I thought I could say that to, not always, it depended on the kid, you think, what you think is you'll be lying there, everyone will be standing around saying, you know, I wish we'd treated her or him better. And they go, yes, they would go. And I said, well, actually, you won't know because you'll be dead. You know, I think often for younger teenagers, they have no idea of the finite nature of death. So, you know, but mostly I talked about what it did to families, the impact it had, and talked at length about that. When I left the school after about over 10 years after my son committed suicide, in the farewell speech, the head of counselling said, thanks to her work, we haven't had a suicide. And I thought, of all the nice farewell speeches, that was the one that's stuck in my mind, because, so that was one of the ways that I was able to use what I had learned, and the whole thing also helped me develop empathy, because I never want to be one of those people that walked out of their way to avoid it. So I've learned a lot about acceptance and about empathy, that, you know, you want to be the person that can go up and say, I am so sorry about what's happened for you. And I have learned in recent years that that's what people really need when they are, especially in those initial stages of grief, they need to feel they're not alone. The other thing I found hard is when grief, I mean, it took me the grief was raw for at least 2 years, really raw. And people wanted to fix it. They thought it was something that could be fixed, and grief can't be fixed. And so I ended up spending a lot of time with my dog because my dog didn't feel it had to fix anything. My dog was happy just to be with me, because there was this feeling that, oh, she's hurting so much, how can I fix it? Well, actually, it's easier to say to people, you know, I feel for you, let me know if I can help, and then just let people grieve, you know, because you can't fix it.
And I think grief can take many forms for different people, and some people it may take a longer period for them to go through that process, and for others it can be quite quickly. And there's no right or wrong way as such, but I guess what is important is that at some level you go through that process, because if you don't, that stuff's just going to stay there and come out in other ways. Did you find those conversations that you had helped your own grieving process?
It was good with teenagers, because if I started to cry and I'd just say, it is hard for me to talk about this without crying, but let's talk about your situation, they could accept that. Because other people seem to think, oh, someone's crying, what do I do? But often, you know, so even now when I'm often talking about my son, I can feel the tears come to my eyes, because there's still that hold, and that will always be there. But the grief isn't as raw, you know, so I've been able to get on with my life, but it's going to always it's always going to be there. There's always going to be that loss. The other thing I noticed, and this was something that many people wouldn't believe, is that overwhelming grief really affects your cognitive ability. The way your ability to, because it's so overwhelming. And I have tried to say, you know, if it affects, you know, I just found it affected my cognitive ability. What does it do to kids who, you know, because I was in a school context and thinking, you know, we think kids can come back to school and get on with their lives, and after they've lost a parent, what is it doing for them? But a lot of teachers, I think it's that kind of thing that once you experience, you stop and think, hey, aren't we expecting those kids to get on with their lives and be able to manage much too early? But, you know, I don't really have an answer for that one.
And I mean, it's like, I think in some ways, younger people tend to be a little bit more adaptable and a little less set in their ways, but at the same time, they might not have developed the same skills to deal with trauma as such. So it can work against them, it can work for them. Possibly depending on how early in the piece it happens. I don't know. I mean, you talked about that family dynamic and how for different parts of the family it affected them in different ways, because obviously of their relationship to your son and what it meant to them. In terms of and you also talked about that, I call it uncomfortableness that people had in terms of, was there a reasonable openness within the family unit to talk about this?
Yes. My mother said, "You'll never get over this." And I looked at her and said, "Your mother did." Because my mother's, this just isn't quite, my mother's brother also killed himself. Okay. Also kind of a mixture of depression and alcohol. And she looked at me and said, "What?" And I said, "Your mother went through this, your family's been through this. She got over it. I guess eventually I will." So we had a conversation about that. I think for my parents it was just massive sadness. Yeah, for most of my family. For my daughter and I, that kind of just leaves us. Yeah. What it did was bring us closer together. The reason she ended up teaching in the same school as me is because she wanted to be in the same, opportunity arose and she wanted to be somewhere where she could support me. Yeah. And it was really great because for 9 years we were teaching the same place and saw each other nearly every day, and that was really great. Yeah. So for the family, when I talk about family not coping, I'm talking about the family were fine. It's kind of other people outside the family. Yeah. And when I'm talking about people wanting to fix it, that was mainly friends who think, friends and acquaintances. Yeah.
So I guess for someone who perhaps had recently or semi-recently had someone close to them take their life or commit suicide as such, is without necessarily trying to fix the situation, is there anything that you could sort of offer them to help them in that process? Yeah,
listen to the person who's grieving. And I look back and I think, I must have been a pain. I was kind of fixated, obsessed, and probably just went over and over and over, so focused on myself, which is probably a natural part of grief. Yeah. But I think at that stage, people, the person who's grieving does need someone who will listen. Even if they end up repeating themselves and going over and over the same things, it just needs someone to feel, that they're listening. Yeah. I have a friend who knew my son from when he was about 9 months old. And my son was the most charming, lovable person, but he could also be a rogue. And she often says, "Oh, that little shit. God, he was a little shit." Yeah. Well, actually, he wasn't. He was a very kind of full-on naughty boy. Yeah. He could be naughty, he could be the most loving boy, but he could be naughty and rat bag. But when she says that, it reminds me that he was of the realness of him. Whereas I think in death, other people tend to sanctify the person. Yeah. They place them on this pedestal and make them out to be something that they often aren't. And in saying that, she reminds me of how real he is, and it's good to talk about him with her because she's happy to say, she wasn't sanctifying him in a way that other people do. Yeah.
And I think, because people are going through that grieving process, I think there's a tendency to maybe be walking on eggshells and tread a little lightly, and they don't want to necessarily say anything to offend the person, but at the same time, for someone who's grieving, they're really wanting genuine connection, so that they can help work through that process. So I guess it's sometimes a fine line, but it's not necessarily doing what you feel could be right, but just responding to the situation.
Yeah, responding to that feeling. When I talk about it now, even now, the Pacifica kids still say, "I'm sorry for your loss." There's still that instant response. Yeah. And I thought that is such a natural response. They know there's a loss and they can still say, "I'm sorry for your loss." Even all these years later, they're still acknowledging that was a loss. And certainly in the months after, that was wonderful when they were just saying, "I'm sorry for your loss, miss." Yeah. Because it was said with heart. Yeah. And they didn't need to actually say much else.
Yeah. Because if I think about my own situation, there have been times where I haven't said anything because I guess haven't known what to say, and you've kind of, and I was probably overcomplicating it, to be honest, because I was worried about what I might say not being what was required or what was justified, but let's just keep it simple.
I have to say that for years, when I was nervous, I'd smile. So I'd be trying to commiserate with people about something or give condolences and be smiling out of nervousness.
Yeah.
This actually did break that habit. So I can now, give condolences and talk about loss without smiling. And that was kind of a nervous reaction in a situation. Yeah.
So do you think our culture, and I guess talk about Western culture, New Zealand culture, has not really acknowledged death or loss in a genuine way?
I think there's very much an expectation in the kind of paki out culture and probably the whole Western culture. The funeral's over, you can get on with it. Until people have experienced loss of a close loved one, they still think, oh, okay, once the funeral's over, you can get on with it. And they don't realise in some ways the funeral's just the beginning, because before that you're kind of in shock. And I didn't never really have the anger, because they talk about the stages of grief. I never felt anger. I did feel deep sadness that anyone would feel such despair to take their own life. There was a series of books I'd read in my early 30s, I went forever, called The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, and the greatest evil in there was despair. It was the thing that could destroy the world, despair. And so that stuck in my mind, and that's what I felt from my son, beyond the shock and the grief, was overwhelming sadness that he should feel such despair to take his own life. But in terms of the anger, I never really got the anger. Marie had the anger, and she probably still feels it, that this brother she was so close to would abandon her like that.
Hey, listen, Kay, well, thank you very much for spending some time with me today, and I guess talking about your story and taking what I guess is a very difficult situation and being able to turn that around so that you can, in essence, help others deal with that and have some positive results within the school you have. I mean, that's just really amazing. So well done to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nathan.